Writing DataWeave expressions. Here we're looking at an example DataWeave expression with the input on the left, the output that comes out on the right, and the transformation information in the middle. Now inside of this DataWeave language, the header contains the directives, high-level info about the transformation. The body contains a DataWeave expression that generates the output structure. DataWeave expressions is a data model for the output. It is not dependent upon the types of the input and output, but more so their structures. And it's against this model that the transformation itself will happen. The data model of produced output can consist of three different general types of data. Objects represented as a collection of key value pairs. Arrays represented as a sequence of objects, typically comma delimited. And simple literals. Now, one of the key places to start with your DataWeave expressions is the output directive, and this will basically define the output type the transformation will generate. It's specified by using content type, and you can use content types like application JSON, XML, Java, CSV, and even application DataWeave. The structure of the output is defined in the DataWeave body. Now, within Studio, we have the ability to preview transformations. As you write the DataWeave expression, a live preview in the output on the right will be shown. You will not see actual values unless you add sample data in, as we will in our examples. Now, to add sample data for live transformations, we can go to the left in the input section and we can add sample data in. If it already knows the structure, we could fill in a preset structure, or as you can see in this picture, it'll allow us to select the format of our sample data. Once selecting the format, in the bottom picture, you can see on the left that we've got a JSON array with first name Max and last name Mule. And then on the right, you can see the transformation we eventually generate with the information in the middle. Now there's also this notion of setting input data MIME types. When you run your application, you can get an error unless the MIME type is obvious for the input data that has been set. It could be set automatically, especially if the message source or something in the transformation process or processing process has picked up and set the MIME type. Otherwise, you can set this explicitly. Many transformers are going to have a MIME type property. So where is the code when we're writing this DataWeave information? Well, one of the big benefits of DataWeave, especially if you've come from Data Mapper, is the code is simply placed in line with your XML. Unlike Data Mapper, where we had this very complex graph file, we have a very simple directive structure and transformation structure that gets put right inside of the XML. Now, commonly, you'll eventually extract this into a separate file and maintain it in source control separately, but it really doesn't matter where you put it from a functional perspective. And as I was describing in the earlier slides, if you are using sample data of some sort, Studio is beginning to store that sample data inside of source test resources. This makes sure that sample data doesn't end up in your final product when you package up the application to deploy to a server. Reusing transformations. To place a transformation in an external file, we can click the data source button when typing in the transformation. This will ensure that the transformation is stored in a DWL file, and these DWL files are stored in source main resources. Of course, the key thing here is we want these files to be included for the sake of our runtime. Now we'll get into our first walkthrough, 12.1, writing our first DataWeave expression. We'll use the DataWeave transform message component, we'll add some sample data and use live preview, and we'll transform form data from JSON to a Java object using DataWeave. Let's get into Studio and get started. Once in Studio, we'll make sure we have all the updates necessary to use Weave in our environment. We'll start off by going up to the Help menu and checking for updates. Now, in your case, if you do have available updates, now would be a great time to pause the video and go through all of the updates. Make sure they're all installed so that you see a no updates were found, just as I do here. Otherwise, you might not actually have Weave as an option in your environment. Once you're back and you've got your Studio completely up to date, let's also make sure that we've got the newest ESB runtime available to us. We'll go up to the Help menu and go to Install New Software. By dropping down the Work With box, you're going to find that there is an area called Mule ESB Runtimes for Anypoint Studio. And we'll expand the Anypoint Studio Enterprise Runtimes. Scrolling to the bottom of the available runtimes, you'll see that there is a new runtime available, 3.7.1, At the time of this recording, 3.7.1 is the newest, but there might even be a newer one. We'll choose the newest option that we have here and check it. And then we'll go through with the installation by hitting next, next, agree, finish, all the different prompts that you'll get to install this runtime. Once the runtime has finished installing, you can go ahead and restart Studio as it will ask you to, and meet back at the main Studio interface. Once back in Studio, we want to make sure that we can update our Mule server version being used. In the bottom left of our Package Explorer, you're going to find a mule-project.xml. Let's double-click. Inside of this Mule project XML, you'll find a drop-down for the newest server runtime, or any server runtime, really. Drop this down, and be sure you're on the newest runtime. Many of you might be going from 3.6 upwards to 3.7. It may warn you that there might be some different namespace updates and things that need to happen, and that it will do some updating, and we will hit yes to this dialog. We can then close the Mule project XML, and by looking at your Package Explorer on the left, you can verify that you're now using the Mule server 3.7.1 runtime. The next thing we might wish to do is make sure that our API kit is also on the newest version. To make sure that we have the newest API kit, let's go up into Help and Install New Software. Now, while this could have possibly came in automatically through your check for updates, it won't hurt to check. We'll drop down our Work With dropdown, and we'll go to the API Kit Update site. Inside of the API Kit Update site, we'll open up the API Kit Studio plugin, and if there's any available updates to install, go ahead and pause the video and install those now, just like you did the Mule ESB runtime. Now our goal is to update this API kit with the newest version. In fact, in the past, you might have seen that mine had a version 1.6, so let's pretend that this is an older version, and if you look at your API kit library on the left of your screen, it's quite possible that you'll see an older version here. There's a couple ways that we could change this dependency, but one really convenient way, we could simply right-click on the dependency, go to Build Path, and configure the build path. Now in the configuration dialog, we can select the API kit and just remove it from our build path. Think of this like taking the library out altogether, and then hit OK. Now Studio is going to pair API kit version to the Mule ESB version that we're currently using, which is quite convenient for us. So if we were to simply go into our application and open up the MUA XML where we defined our API in an earlier exercise, let's go ahead and bring in the API kit router into the MUA flow, basically duplicating it. Now once you release, it's going to realize that you do not have the API kit router set up already as far as the library is concerned, and add that library in for you. Now it's been placed inside of the MUA main flow. You've got a duplicate along with the newest version, in this case 1.7.1. Now we do of course want to make sure that we remove that duplicate router. It was just a little dummy router to update to the newest runtime. We'll then save our project and continue on. Let's now head back to the getFlights XML and make sure that this XML file is open on our machine. We're also going to locate the getFlights form flow inside of here. Again, remember that this is what data gets posted to and then eventually sent off. We're going to add a breakpoint to the flow reference component inside of this flow. And we'll save the file, and we'll debug the application. Now, assuming you've updated to the newest version of Studio, a little trick I'll show you here, you now can right-click in the canvas and debug right from the application. If you were using debug through a different methodology, that will still work, but just to let it be known that this is a bit of a convenience for you. So I'll debug the application. When you do go to debug for the first time, it might pop up and warn you, hey, there's a Mule runtime version mismatch that I want to tell you about. So we'll go ahead and hit Edit Configuration. And I'll make sure that the target server runtime in the debug config matches that of the newest runtime I've set in the projects config. I'll hit Apply, and then hit Debug. Now once this application starts up, we'll start some debugging. We'll start off by going to a web browser and hitting localhost 8081/flights. After hitting this address, we'll be presented with a form that we're quite used to. In this form, we'll make some type of selection, if any, and click Find Flights. This should trigger the breakpoint in Studio that we just set up. Let's return to Studio and see what Debugger has to tell us. Back within Studio, we're in the Debugger view. We can see that we're at the getFlight's form flow, and we're currently stopped at our breakpoint. Inside of the Debugger view, we can see we've currently got a buffered input stream. And looking at our inbound properties, we should also be able to see that the content type is application JSON. This will be pretty helpful for the DataWeave transformation we're about to set up. Now from debug, we'll go ahead and stop the runtime so we can do some different changes inside of here. First thing that we're going to do is get rid of the JSON to object transformer. We're then going to add a DataWeave transformation inside of here. Now by typing in DataWeave, you'll see that you have a transform message option available to you. We'll drag that into the getFlight's form flow in between HTTP and the flow reference. Now, inside of the transform message properties view, if we double click to make sure that that's available to us, in the transform section, you're going to see some different information that we can start typing. By default, we can go inside of here and type in payload. And we'll also go ahead and get rid of these brackets. Now, if you do get a pop-up like this saying that the resource ran out of sync, you can go ahead and hit OK. And if it does pop up again, an easy fix is you can simply click in the canvas and go back to DataWeave. But ideally, we want our script to look something like this with the payload. Now we're going to take a look at debugging the application with this new DataWeave piece in here. And again, all we've changed is put in the payload. So add that breakpoint back to getFlight's flow if it's not already there. I'll debug the application. And once this starts up, we'll go back to our browser and test it out. Back inside of our browser, we'll send another request through by hitting Find Flights. We'll then return to Studio, where we should have a breakpoint in place that has stopped our particular message. Now we can see in here that it's produced something of size 2, and if we open this up, we can see the information of the key that it's generated, or key value pairs rather, with the linked hash map. We can see the destination is SFO, and the airline is all. Now let's go ahead and hit the resume button, and we'll go back to the transform message processor. Inside of here, let's see if we can insert some sample data so that we can actually preview what effect we're having on our message. To do this, in the input area, we can select the payload and click this pencil icon. Upon clicking the pencil icon, it will ask us what type of data we want to sample. Let's do JSON, and then hit OK. In the input window, we can now construct some JSON to work with. So let's go ahead and follow the model similar to what the form posts. We'll go ahead and put in a destination, and the value for destination will be SFO. And then as a second key value pair, we'll put in airline, and airline will have a value of United. Now if you look to the right, you can see what it's generating in the output. It's giving us a linked hash map with a destination of SFO and an airline of United. Now let's take a look at what changing the output type might do to us. If we were to go inside of here for the output, and we were to change this from application Java to application XML, you'll notice that it says it can't update the preview. Something with the mappings were incorrect. Now we'll get to this a little bit later, but the structure of XML needs to be described slightly different than that of JSON. So if we were to go in here and just type in application/JSON instead, you'll see that inside of the output slot there is in fact an ability to see this particular item. Now if we go ahead and save these changes, we should still be in debug mode. And if you're not, no problem, just go ahead and debug the application one more time. We'll go back to our form, and we'll click Find Flights again. And then back in Studio, we'll be at our breakpoint. So going over to Mule Debugger, inside of the Debugger tab, you can see underneath the payload section that it's got this new thing called a weave message, and it looks a lot different. Now we're going to get more into what this affects and what we're producing here very, very soon, but for the time being, all of the data should be inside of here in some capacity. So let's go ahead and stop the Mule runtime. we'll go back to the transform message and we'll change from application JSON back to application Java to get us back to what we eventually want. We'll also right-click on the DataWeave transformer and rename it so that it says JSON to Java, and it's obvious what transformation that we're doing. We'll then go ahead and save the file. Now let's see where exactly this code went, like we were talking about in the slides, or rather the sample data. We'll go under Source Test Resources and go into the sample data folder, and you'll find a JSON.json file. We can open this up, and inside of here we can see that the sample data is being stored and persisted in Studio. Now the great thing about this location is it won't be included when we package it up to deploy to the server, as this is just a design time convenience for us. Let's now go back into our application, getFlightsXML, and we'll go into the configuration XML as well. Inside of the configuration XML, you're going to find that the DataWeave is placed in line. So the actual DataWeave script is available inside of here as set payload. That's all for now. Let's go ahead and save up our project, and we'll continue on with some more information about different structures. As we saw in our example, XML can only have one top-level value, and that value must be an object with one property. This will throw an exception in the top picture here, where we can see that we're simply trying to map using this more JSON-like structure. You can't really map this into XML without a higher level object. In the bottom picture, it would work if we had that higher level container, such as user, that was holding first name and last name, because that would then construct the XML, as you can see on the output towards the right. Now, if we do want to construct XML, but we want certain fields to be part of an attribute rather than an actual element inside, we can use this @ syntax, where we include the attribute name followed by the attribute value. So you can see here that we're taking Max and Mule, but making sure that Max's first name is actually an attribute on the user element. So let's take a look at some more expressions for XML input to output. By default, only XML elements and not attributes are created as JSON fields or Java objects. To change this behavior in any way, we can use the @ to reference attributes. So we can see here, if you follow the transformation logic in the three pairs here, or the three items here rather, we can see the input coming in with user first name Max with the last name of Mule. If we just map the payload, the user is going to come in and the last name Mule will be used, but Max won't really be used. If we do payload.user, we're going to receive just last name Mule, basically omitting that user container. And then below that, if we do first name payload.user at first name, we will be grabbing the attribute first name, which would of course include Max, and then just payload.user.last name would include Mule. Do note that we want to update Studio and make sure that it's currently on its newest version. In live preview for the XML sample input didn't work in 5.2.0, but assuming you did check for updates, as we talked about earlier, you'll actually be able to sample this stuff inside of Studio when we get there. Now, you can also reference message variables. So far we've strictly done the payload, but you can also reference flowvars, inbound properties, and outbound properties. And keep in mind that this is not Mule expression language, so we want to be sure that we're not preferencing things with message dot like we're used to, or using the hash brackets. Now, if there are multiple transformations we want to do, we can create these multiple transformations with a transform message component. We can set where to store the results, so we could even do transformations into flow variables, session variables, or outbound properties. And you can see at the bottom here, there's different tabs that will show up for all the different payload transformations we're doing, potential flow vars, session vars, output properties, and so on. And we can add new transformations by adding in the little plus sign in the bottom right. So let's try some of this out. In the next walkthrough, we're going to transform basic Java, JSON, and XML data structures. We'll write transformations to store data in multiple outputs, different types of data in different variables. We'll create a second transformation that does the output data as JSON, and then a third transformation that does it as XML. Let's meet up in Studio and get started. Now I've returned to the getFlightsXML, and just be aware that my screen is slightly shrunk and I've minimized some areas of Studio just for the sake of zooming and making that a bit easier for you to see. Your Studio might look slightly different, but the key thing is you want to make sure you're in getFlightsXML. Now let's go ahead and open up the JSON to Java component that we were working in a little bit earlier. I'm going to make some of these sections just a little bit bigger so they're a bit easier for us to read. Great. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add in some extra transformations. So we'll go ahead and click Add New Transformation in the bottom of DataWeave. Now we'll go ahead and add a new transformation by hitting the plus sign in the bottom of DataWeave. This has generated a new transformation called myvar. Let's go ahead and title this JSON so it's a little bit more clear what it's doing. We'll also change the output type from application Java to application JSON. Now we'll also go ahead and change this expression so that it is in fact pointing to the payload again, just like we did earlier. And you'll notice that now that it has a valid expression, it will in fact produce a preview output on the right for us to see. Now let's change this DataWeave expression up ever so slightly to see how it affects our output on the right. So instead of just doing payload, let's go ahead and do data as a key, and then we'll do space payload. Now you'll notice on the right the impact this has is now we've got data as a higher level element holding two objects inside of it, destination and airline. Now we'll change this up a little bit more. Instead of just having data here, let's go ahead and put in some curly braces, and we'll also remove payload altogether. Now you can see the general data structure that it's starting to create, an object holding data which is holding some object which is currently empty. We'll add a field inside of here, and we'll call this field hub, and we'll make the hub name MUA. And we can see again how this structure is essentially being created. Now let's go ahead and add a couple more fields in. Along with hub, let's go ahead and put in code, and inside of code we'll ask for payload dot, and after payload dot we'll put in destination. Now you'll notice here I didn't get autocomplete and a lot of errors are getting thrown. One of the things that you'll need to do when you're separating these different elements in the DataWeave language is to put a comma here, something that throws me off quite a bit. So if we go in and we put in payload dot again, as I was attempting to show you a little bit earlier, we can put in payload dot destination, and you'll see kind of the syntax highlighting that'll come up. And a little bit later when we make some more changes, we'll see how we'll get autocomplete to pop up when we provide some metadata. Now we'll drop down and we'll do the same thing for airline. We'll say airline, and then we'll provide payload dot airline as the expression, again remembering our comma one higher level up on code. So let's go ahead and see what this produces for us. We'll save up the application just as we did before. And if we're already running in debug mode, this should restart. If you're not running in debug mode, go ahead and run it in debug mode again, ensuring you have a breakpoint on the getFlightsFlow reference inside of here. We'll now meet up inside of our web browser and test this out. Back inside of our browser, we'll send another request through. Once that request goes through, we'll go back to Studio and examine this in debug mode. At the breakpoint, we can now go into the variables category, and in the variables category, if we bring the JSON variable up ever so slightly, we'll see that the data is now available inside. So we can see how in a single processor we have the ability to write to many different scopes with different transformations. Now let's take this a little bit further with an XML transformation. So we'll go ahead and stop the runtime if it's currently running, and we'll go back to DataWeave. Now similar to what we did before, let's go ahead and add another expression in. And let's call this expression XML. Now with the XML transformation in place, we'll go ahead and change the output type to application XML. And as we saw before, this is potentially a problem where it can't actually update our mapping. So let's change things around just as we did before. We'll go ahead and remove the curly braces, and we'll put in data, payload. Now we can see the structure on the right is a little bit different from what we saw before. We've now got the data as the higher level element, and inside of data, the different elements in the payload are elements part of data. Now let's go ahead and go back to our JSON tab, and let's copy the transformation model inside of here and paste that inside of the XML. Now this works as well because data is a higher level element that's going to hold hub, code, and airline in it just fine. Now let's pretend for a moment that we want hub to be a little bit higher level inside of here, and then we want an element called flight that holds the flight for the specific hub. So inside of here, we'll go in and we'll put in flight and add curly braces for flight, and then close off flight at the end of airline and code. And I'll add some additional indentation here to make it a little bit clearer. I'll also remove this extra curly brace, and now you can see the structure it's generated. We've got data, which includes the hub, And then we potentially, in a realistic case, could have multiple flights inside of here that are just kind of iterated through with all the different flights for all the different airlines. Let's now change this up ever so slightly again, and let's pretend that we would like the United piece to be part of the flight's attribute, basically an attribute that says airline. Well, as we talked about before, inside a flight, what we can do here is we can use the @ sign. And with the @ sign, we can specify inside of parentheses that we want the airline attribute to be the value of payload.airline. And we can also remove this extra expression at the bottom. And then for code, we'll remove the extra comma since it's no longer needed. And you can see the structural change that's happened here. We've now got airline United, and we've now got code SFO. So let's go ahead and debug the application one more time and just see what we've affected. We'll go ahead and save this up, debug the project, and we'll go back over to our flight system and hit Find Flights. And once Find Flights has been hit, we'll go to Debugger. We can now see inside of the variables area that we've got JSON and XML available to us. And by selecting these, we can see the two impacts that our transformations have in fact had on these particular items.